Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today's podcast features Don DeBar, the producer and host of Community Public Radio News. I apologize in advance for the sound quality on today's episode. We had some issues with the recording that haven't come up before, and we hope don't happen again. As the world moved toward Easter, the Attorney General of the United States rolled away the stone of secrecy to permit the truth to come forth in the form of the Gospel according to St. Mueller. The nation's mainstream media stenographers gathered breathlessly to examine the contents for any signs of the resurrection of their hopes for a swift end to the Trump presidency. They were determined that the story they had been promoting for 2 years could not die, and in spite of the gospel's actual words, they clung to their hopes. The first chapter of Mueller's gospel repeat the allegations made in his indictments of the Internet Research Agency of St. Petersburg and the alleged hacking of the DNC emails by the main directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, known as the GRU. Mueller is trying to preserve the Russia hacked our democracy narrative. I began by asking Don DeBar whether he thought they were succeeding.
If by repeating allegations over and over and over again you succeed in proving them, yes. If by offering evidence that normally would be required to either obtain criminal conviction or at least an indictment in front of a somewhat objective grand jury, not at all. There's no evidence. Almost there's no evidence at all. I recently was doing a discussion of this with someone. Compared it to having the media, declare that there's proof that Hillary Clinton, sleeps with goats, and there's photographic evidence, and then you have this report that makes a statement that Hillary Clinton sleeps with goats, and there's evidence, and the evidence is as follows. And then there's 2 paragraphs blacked out, and then a reference to an Exhibit A, which is a blank page. It says redacted. So, according to that standard, at best, they've proven it.
Both of these things have been rebutted before, it seems to me. There's been a lot of work trying to analyze the actual amount of material that the Internet Research Agency, the amount of ads, the amount of money spent. And then, of course, there's Bill Binney's analysis, in which indicates that it is not a hack, but it was an internally downloaded information.
Right, a leak. In other words, somebody did it on their local computer rather than over the internet. Right. And then handed over a copy of a file. The technical argument that Binney presents is a pretty simple one to understand if you know anything about how computers operate and networks and such. And of course, that's a small number of people, unfortunately. It can be rebutted, the argument, certainly, but it indicates very, very strongly and almost beyond rebuttal that the agreed upon narrative is the public narrative in the U.S. that this was a hack is wrong. Now, the reason that matters is that the obvious method of investigation is completely ignored. So looking at the actual computer was refused. The FBI didn't want to do that. It's as if someone walked onto a piece of property on the plain view of a videotape, broke into a building on the plain, in the plain view of video cameras on videotape, walked in, shot somebody on camera, turned around and left. That person had worn, all kinds of rubber and plastic, so there's no fingerprints and hair or anything else. And they sat down and started using radioactive material to try to determine who it was, instead of looking at the videotape and then coming out with evidence that's completely rebuttable, actually a somewhat fantastic interpretation of some piece of rubber that they found on the scene somewhere, and ignoring a videotape that perhaps shows an entirely different person altogether. That's essentially the situation that we have with Binney's claim. Binney's claim pretty much demonstrates the official version is wrong. The way to prove the official version right would have been actually very easy. All they had to do was look at the actual computers, and the FBI said, no, we don't have to do that.
The remainder of the report is divided into like pre-election and post-election contacts or attempted contacts between the Trump campaign or the Trump transition team, in the latter case with various Russians. During the campaign section, there's allegations about the Trump Tower Moscow project, the famous June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, meetings between Jeff Sessions and Ambassador Kislyak, among others.
The argument that is presented, essentially, by the way, they spoke to some Russians. That should prove something.
Oh, yes.
Of course, for the campaign, I spoke with Russians. I spoke with Americans in Moscow somewhat regularly, actually. Mark Sloboda and the Peter Lavelle and, some Russians like Dmitry Babich and others. My intention was to provide information to the electorate at that time, because it was during the campaign season, that would expose the wrongdoing of the U.S. government up to that point, which meant it would be weighted against Hillary Clinton. I mean, that wasn't the sole purpose of it, but that was certainly true. That, for example, discussion in 2011 that I was having, here, doing our newscast and the work that we do here in CPR studios. It was in 2011, we were covering the destruction of Libya by Obama and Hillary Clinton, and a number of other misdeeds prior to and subsequent to. We worked regularly, and I discussed these things with Russians in addition to others and Americans in Russia. Is that forbidden? Does that indicate malintent? Does that make me a puppet of Putin or some foreign power? Does it make me even an agent for a foreign government? Or does it make me someone who's doing, fact-finding and using, among other sources, some that have primary knowledge of part of the story? For Trump being elected president, if the other side is saying the biggest threat facing us right now is Russia, why in the hell wouldn't you start talking to him to find out what it is exactly you're going to be dealing with if you win the election? Any contact whatsoever was either going to be damning politically while they were doing a massive assault on Trump in the media. If you'll recall, after he got elected, there was an avalanche of challenges to the election itself, politically and then legally it began. Jill Stein started with the process that they started in Wisconsin. In the context of that, all of a sudden, if Trump is proven and politically to have spoken to anything, I even used Russian dressing on a sandwich. Political that in the middle of this attack on his victory, his electoral victory, and so you have the group of people around him. It doesn't surprise me that someone would say, if you say, "Did you ever speak to anyone in Russian?" No. Russians, no, hell no. And so you get a couple of them caught up. Oh, I forgot I spoke to this guy for 2 minutes on a stage once. But the fact that they had any contact at all is somehow part of the conclusions here that, in fact, Russia had, this game that intended to, and in fact did, impact the election in 2016, which is ridiculous.
Well, I noticed that after 100 pages of stuff about pre-election contacts, the report starts a section on post-election contacts with the words, quote, and I'm quoting, "As soon as the news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared not to have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect." End quote.
Right.
So that pretty much decimates the preceding 100 pages, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, exactly. There's an election. I'm the president of Russia or the president of South Pago. First, you send a telegraph. Dear President-elect Trump, congratulations. Love to sit down over dinner sometime and discuss continuation of the contract for the McDonald's at the South Pago Airport. Whatever it is, that business that you do with the United States, there's a new sheriff in town, as they say. Might as well get to know the new sheriff. So I don't know how that's evidence of anything other than being awake the day that Trump won the election. Also, even if you're just someone that's interested in politics, like most heads of state and government officials are, after seeing the 2016 election and seeing that Trump won it, most people would be, damn, let's talk to this guy. How did he do that? Because it was a remarkable phenomenon all by itself. Again, there are a million reasons why Russia would try to contact Trump after the election that completely have nothing to do with influencing the election, because the election is over.
Right.
And so the indicia, of course, here, the purpose for reciting it here immediate after the election is that they had to start making contact. Why? Because there were no prior contacts. Nothing useful. There was this guy spoke to that one here, that one spoke to that one there. Nothing that would elevate itself to the kind of contact that would have any purpose between the two governments as Trump became government. In other words, nothing functional that had been functioning before to accomplish any other task, like let's take over the United States.
Well, also, Trump did not have a typical foreign policy team within his campaign. He was not really surrounding himself with experienced foreign policy hands who would have already had these Russian contacts and been able to tap them.
Look, I'm managing Trump's campaign. I'm looking at the, whatever millions of dollars I got as opposed to the $2 billion that Clinton's got. I've got money to spend. How much of it am I going to spend, cultivating foreign policy experts to help me govern before the election? None. I'm spending all the money I got getting elected. We'll deal with that later. Right now, the task is we're outgunned, outnumbered, out everything else in terms of the election. Whatever resources we got, we focus on winning the Electoral College with the sharpest focus that we can, which is exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's down to the person in these districts in those three states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Then we'll sweat finding the foreign policy experts to sit down with and test my instincts, for example, that, maybe it's a good idea to talk to these guys in Moscow instead of having a nuclear holocaust, and see if I can find some policy people that will agree with that and help chart out a course. Because there's probably somebody out there that agrees with me on that point.
You would think.
It sure as hell ain't Bolt, the three stooges of foreign policy, Abrams, Bolton, right, and Pompeo.
You're listening to Don DeBar, producer and host of CPR News and longtime progressive activist and broadcaster, talking with me about the Mueller Report. This is Wider View Radio, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and the podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on our Facebook page at Wider View Radio. And now back to our conversation with Don DeBar. Former CIA analyst Larry Johnson wrote on his blog recently that he thinks the FBI had informants within the Trump campaign, people who were, as the FBI is famous for doing, trying to entrap campaign officials into contact with Russians. If so, this is really alarming and deserves congressional investigation. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, first of all, it seems pretty obvious that has happened. You had the whole FISA warrant thing, the purpose of which was to surveil senior campaign officials. So, that surveillance is carried out, in essence, since it's domestic, it's most properly carried out by the FBI. Now, we haven't seen all of the materials that, deal with that. That's part of that methods and practices, or whatever the magic language they use, exemption that, keeps some of the evidence, quote unquote, away from our eyes in this report, and I'm sure whatever else gets released. But somewhere, if it hasn't been shredded or changed or altered in one way or fashion down the memory hole, there's evidence of who exactly the informants were, and who they were agents of, and under whose orders they were being deployed, and who they were reporting to, and all of that. Because these things either were done outside of the law completely, or flowed from the FISA warrant, or were the product of some other process that yet is unknown to us. There was another FISA warrant, or there was some other kind of warrant from some court, or some super emergency presidential executive order thing, or whatever the hell cover they come out with for people who were, in essence, undermining the U.S. election. In fact, not Russians, American intelligence operatives undermining the U.S. election because they disagreed with the policy of one of the two candidates. I mean, in reality, if you were going to take the facts that can be proven, like the existence of the FISA warrant and the basis upon which it was issued, which is that idiot report from the Great Britain with Trump peeing on a bed in Moscow because supposedly hooker that with a hooker on a bed that supposedly Obama slept in. If that was really the basis of all of this, then it's obvious that the real crime that was committed here was committed by the last administration and its operatives, and the crime was one against the very nature of the democracy by thwarting the will of the people at an election in favor of U.S. intelligence.
Absolutely. Reflecting on this episode, there appear to be two very willing victims, though: the mainstream media and the Democratic Party. And both of them push this Russian collusion narrative, and both of them still seem unwilling to let it go. They want to impeach Trump now for obstructing an investigation into a crime that was not committed. So I think they're going to pay a price for this, don't you?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd characterize them as victims. I mean, if you think it through, the Democratic Party, for example, the DNC, may not have had their candidate win. Okay, but if you think about the nature of these things, that committee, like the Republican National Committee, by the way, serves the same master that U.S. intelligence serves, and/or serves U.S. intelligence, wherever the real locus of power is in the middle of all of that stuff. And the policies that their person would have been bringing to the White House and to Washington, D.C., and to the world, by way of that, have been thwarted thus far. So they haven't lost. In addition to that, the media, it's not apparent to me that they have an interest outside of following instructions and, continuing to be employed, basically. The various talking heads at MSNBC, CNN, Fox, you can go now, in my opinion, across the board from the National Enquirer to Democracy Now, and maybe shrink some of the apparent space between the two of them. The actual separate interest that one might think that they have in informing the public, it doesn't hold up. Its existence doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you look at the actual behavior over the course of this entire affair. And so, I don't necessarily believe that anyone is a loser in that area just because of what's happened, but rather they're agents of bringing that to us. The only loser here would be anyone who hoped that there was some measure of integrity in the U.S. legal and electoral systems, and in the media, and in the highest echelons of government. And for those of us who see that this is a problem, we saw that it was a problem before the election in 2016. and before the election in 2000, and even you could go back at least to the election in 1944 after they pushed Wallace out in favor of Harry Truman and essentially brought us within 3 years of that, the CIA, McCarthy, the whole thing that's followed since then. So,
yeah, the Democratic Party is also, I think are going to be hurt by this and by their continuing focus, because it seems to me a lot of the focus here has been that Trump is the problem. It's really all just Trump. And if we can somehow get rid of Trump, everything will be fine. But Trump is essentially enacting standard Republican policy, with a few exceptions.
Well, Trump's doing what he has to do to get reelected. He got elected by the Republican base and independents and people that were angry over a number of things, whether it was, we saw something like 10, 15%, according to polls, of Sanders voters, for example, voted for Trump. Others, there are enough people that are aggrieved in one way or another to vote for somebody who was holding themselves out as an anti-establishment candidate and who ends up being one of the only, choices for that are seen as viable. Again, I think there's a mistake assuming that somehow the Democratic Party is losing because their candidates don't get elected. Their candidates still remain on the payroll. The operation still gets, funded. Mm-hmm. They continue to be a focal point of policy articulation, if not policy making, and it ends up being the policy that prevails in the main across the government. So whether they do it by winning elections, or by appearing to want to win elections and then laying down, or by some other mechanism, their input into the process is an attempt to steer policy in a certain direction. If the policy is going in that direction, it's difficult for me to say that they failed.
Of course, it depends on what policy you're talking about. I mean, certainly in terms of foreign policy, there's not the only differences are in style. I think you could probably say that about domestic policy as well.
I'm not sure that that's true. And here's what I'm talking about. In particular, I mean, the specific thing that is the focal point of the narrative between Trump and the people that are trying to take him out, and has been since the beginning of the campaign, has nothing to do with, the people that fight racism and Islamophobia and immigrant sentiment and, all the things that you and I have been doing for decades. There's all these new voices suddenly chiming in on it. And that's supposedly what offends them about Trump. You mentioned these policies, for example, with immigrants were followed by Obama and Clinton and all these other things. They don't hear any of that. You can dismiss those people for the moment. The thing that's really distinguishing, in fact, is the central narrative, which is what is going to be the relationship with Russia. Is it going to be an adversarial one? And the one in place at the time that Trump was elected was one where you had NATO forces that had been expanding at the urging and diktat of the United States, and the troops and the materiel right up at Russia's borders from the Baltics to the Korean Peninsula, with wargaming going on across that front constantly from at least 2014 until January 2017. Russian planes being shot out of the sky by NATO allies, a whole condition where something could happen, and a political condition where, they're being demonized in the same kind of campaign that being run against Putin that was run against Gaddafi and Assad and, everybody else, Saddam Hussein. In other words, and Noriega. We know what this means when they start talking about the president of the country like that while they're wargaming around the country. That condition was is a fundamental one. And that policy is a fundamental one. And it was the discussion of that policy is the fundamental problem that the institutions of power have, CIA, NSA, et cetera, et cetera. Congress, if you look at the votes that they've had on the sanctions against Russia, the one that they had, whether it was 95% or something voted for, on, more or less on its own sense, Congress's own sense. There's a laugh. This is the main policy objective of the opposition to Trump. It's obvious that that's the case. And if you look at the cost, to taxpayers, for example, if you look at government as basically a hustle whereby you get to steer this group of people's resources into your pocket, then the largest chunk of change is being moved around from public to private, or from private to public to private, has to do with the military budget by far. And the most expensive part of that being either A, the maintenance of occupation troops around the world, and or B, preparation for war with Russia. And they announced $1 trillion renovation of the nuclear deterrent, quote unquote, during Obama's last year in office, for example. That $1 trillion, that obviously, they probably will drop a couple hundred of them on China if push comes to shove, but the bulk of those are for Russia. Well, you get in the way of that, then you're going to see the kind of things that you see, including this report targeting wherever the threat is perceived to exist.
Don, I want to thank you very much for taking time with me today. And thanks again to Don, and I hope you join me next week when my guest will be Danny Haiphong, author of the new book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. In that book, he talks about the new Cold War with Russia, saying, quote, "The war has two fronts. The first is international in scope. Demonizing Russia prepares the American public for another war abroad, this time with a foe in possession of an equal, if not greater, nuclear capacity than the American military. The second front of the new Cold War is domestic. Casting blame on Russia for what transpired during the 2016 presidential election has also led to a counterinsurgency war against dissent similar to that one in the first Cold War." So join me next week with Danny Haiphong. That's our show for this week. Thanks again to Don DeBar for joining me, and I apologize again for the technical issues with the recording. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. Your comments and questions are welcome. Please direct them to widerviewradio@gmail.com. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.